Hello and welcome. I am excited to be here with Stephen Umbrello. Is it Dr. Stephen Umbrello?
Sure, if you want to use the title, I try not to, but yeah,
All right.
technically.
Well, we'll either use it or not use it. But Stephen is the managing director at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and I found out about him through his book, which is a book called Technology Ethics. So the subtitle is Responsible Innovation and Design Strategies. And Stephen's got some really um, interesting insights on the way that technology is developing, the way that we should be sort of managing the development of that technology. And I think the thing that I've appreciated about his take the most is that it sort of avoids many of the tropes that we see in sort of popular media and news where technology is either the savior of mankind or it's the worst thing that's ever happened and we're all going to die. So this middle line is something that I've really appreciated. I'm really excited to talk to you, Stephen. So welcome, and I'm
Thanks for
glad you're here.
inviting me.
Yeah, of course. um, so I read your book and I enjoyed it, and I figured what we'd do is maybe just kind of go over what it's about, give the brief overview, and then sort of discuss some of the nuts and bolts if we can. So you talk about the three popular views of technology, and they are instrumentalism, determinism, and constructivism. Now, rather than have you explain, which might be the logical thing to do, I'll try to explain it to you, and you just correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
So this will be a test for how good you are as a teacher because I learned it from you. So instrumentalism, the idea is that a piece of technology is a tool. It is what the person uses it for. You use the example of guns don't kill people, people kill people.
hmm
And so basically there's no moral, value neutral technology.
That's right.
Then the idea of determinism is that we can't really control technology. It's just going to keep developing and eventually probably cause some problems because we can't really rein it in. And I was reminded of another book I'd read called The Technological Society. I'm sure
hmm
you're familiar with that, right? Jacques Ellul, French guy,
Yep.
and also uh, the Unabomber Manifesto. That's his
hmm
that's his big thing, right? That technology is going to run out of control and we can't control it.
hmm
It's going to cause major problems and we're all going to die. And then constructivism is that technology is sort of a social thing, right? That there's some element of uh, the way that societies use technology. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Is that
It's probably the most complex of the one, and it's not even so simple to define because well, it's all about construction. So it's the way you construct the concept. So technologies are best understood. So social constructivism flips technological determinism on its head, and it argues that society and human actions are the things that shape technologies. So technologies don't develop in a vacuum, they're products of social, political, and economic factors.
okay? Got it. And then I think the one that you are presenting, or at least uh, the one that you feel is most compelling, is this idea of interactionalism.
Mhm.
Now I'll let you define that because I don't want to mess it up.
Sure. So it's probably best I give just another quick run through of the three because they're actually probably even more interesting than the one that I advocate for because well, complex problems require equally complex, if not more, solutions. Um, and and it's probably that reason that the complexity of the kind of solutions that we need to consider when we're talking about technologies are a kind of a barrier for people to talk about them. So we tend to fall into more reductionistic or simplistic narratives, right? And I'm guilty of that all the time too. It's kind of like an automatic tendency. We see it all the time in popular media, movies, even scientific journalism, right? So yeah, you gave a pretty good definition of instrumentalism. It's technology as neutral tools, right? That they're neutral instruments that can be used for various purposes. I gave the example, and you reiterated the one of the gun, right? So it depends on the intentions of the user, which makes it good or bad, or maybe we could just talk about the actions, right? But another classic example is the hammer, right? It can be used to build a house, or in a worst case scenario, you can use it to harm someone, right? The hammer itself is not inherently good or bad. Its moral value depends on the user's intention and use. That's essentially the definition, right? So maybe a more high tech example, because we use the gun. Maybe that's an older tech example, even though they're still modern. It's still a modern technology, always updated. Is social media platforms. So you can think of platforms like Facebook or Twitter from an instrumentalist perspective. So if we take that perspective as our starting point is true, they would say that these platforms are neutral tools that can be used to connect with friends, can be used to share news, to organize social movements, for example. But they can also be
Right.
used to spread misinformation, for example, or to even incite violence. The
And that might be
technology
like,
itself, from this perspective, of course, doesn't dictate these outcomes. It's the user who determines how it's used.
right.
And
And
like
that debate is actually sort of played out when like, for instance, Mark Zuckerberg talks to Congress, right? He'll be like, oh, like people use it in this way, and the people who are more anti or maybe more for reining those technologies in will say, oh, but no, it's a little more nuanced than that.
yeah, each of these narratives, if you want to call them, each of these ways of talking about technology, um, it makes it easy to adopt. And the ones that are often most adopted, so that's instrumentalism, technological determinism, have the benefit of abdicating responsibility of what the technology is, how it's designed, away from the users and the designers. So it's attractive to people, for example, like the creators of Facebook, to say that, well, it just depends on other people, right? It's just another
Mhm.
way of washing hands, right? And
Sure.
the flaw in instrumentalism, there's surely more than one flaw, is that it ignores how these design choices embedded in technology can influence the kinds of behaviors that are even possible, right? So, for example, the algorithmic design of social media platforms can amplify sensational content and thereby encourage the spread of misinformation, even if that wasn't the designer's original intention. And I think that that shows how technologies aren't entirely neutral, because their very design can steer certain behaviors. Lawrence Lessig, he studies law. I can't remember at the university; escapes my mind. But he wrote on code is law, that the very design architecture of the internet permits or constrains certain behaviors. Right? There's certain things that simply are not possible based on the architecture itself. Right? So I think that that's certainly one of the limitations of instrumentalism. And the same kind of goes for technological determinism. That's a little bit more of a fun one. We see this all the time in films, technological determinism. And you gave a pretty good definition, right? The can't kill progress definition, right? So it suggests that technology is an autonomous force. There's various definitions of technological determinism, but I think the most pervasive one is that mm, it's an autonomous force that shapes societies and human behaviors in relatively predictable ways, right? It proposes that technological advancements dictate or orient or guide the direction of social change, which leaves humans with little control over the outcomes. And you can already see why I mentioned the thing about abdicating responsibility, right? Washing your hands. Maybe an example is the printing press, right? So the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, I think, is now it's probably a low tech example, but at the time it was a high tech example, right? It revolutionized the dissemination of information. It led to the spread of literacy, the democratization of knowledge, and eventually it contributed to significant societal changes like the Reformation and the Enlightenment. According to this narrative, if we take it to be true, technological determinism, the printing press was the driving force that transformed society. If you remember in the book, I gave the example of the stirrup, right? Lynn White, in his book, Medieval Technology and Social Change, attributed the entire creation of the feudal system to the creation of what is now an incredibly simple technology, the stirrup that goes on the saddle of a horse. Change the type of armor that could be put on, the distances that could be ridden with that armor on, how logistics changed in medieval times, permitting a certain type of governmental governance system to emerge, right? But like instrumentalism, there's still limitations. This perspective, I think, overlooks the role of human agency and the social context in which that agency works. For instance, the impact of the printing press obviously was not uniform across societies. It depends on various factors. So, literacy rates, the political climate that permitted the printing press or certain books to be printed in the first place, the religious institutions at the time. So, technological determinism also tends to absolve people from this kind of responsibility, which
Sure.
implies that societal changes are inevitable once a technology is introduced. And I think that's evidently not true.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I going into um, reading your book, I was definitely leaning in that direction, the more deterministic direction. Um, well, you can tell from the sorts of books that I just cited. Like I'd kind of, read about it at least a little bit, and I think one of the questions that I had for you, which might be a good jumping point for other stuff, but you used the example of Robert Moses Bridge, or the certain overpasses. And the funny thing is, I'm actually from Long Island, so um,
Oh, that's
I've
cool.
been yeah, so I've been there, I've seen those, um, and I think what it brought to mind for me at least was this distinction um, between the development and the implementation of a technology.
Mm-hmm.
So like Robert Moses didn't make overpasses. That technology had been developed and he
Sure.
implemented it in a
Yep.
certain way. So where I kind of stand now is that I think you've made a compelling case that the way that we can implement technology is certainly within our control. But I still tend to think that the design of a technology or the development of certain technologies is pretty much bound to happen. Even certain technologies that we don't really want to happen, just based on even just political climates, like weapons. We just keep making weapons because we know the other guy's also making weapons, or certain capitalistic features of our society. We're not going to miss out on making that extra money.
Sure.
We see this with Intel right now. Their stock is shot down super low because they decided not to get on the AI train. So
Mm-hmm.
like there are certain constraining factors that
100%.
that create development of technologies even when we don't want them to.
Sure.
Does that
So
does that make sense, or do you have,
A
you
hundred
know?
percent. So that's why I said, like, okay, so we talked about the first two, and I kind of gave a relatively simple definition of the third primary way some people tend to talk about technology. Granted that it's probably not the most widespread one, but it emerged as a response to the overemphasis of falling into technological deterministic narratives. That's social constructivism. Like I said, it flips technological determinism on its head, and I think it overcompensates, just does the exact opposite. So let's use an example just so people have a better idea of what we're talking about. It sounds relatively banal saying that technologies don't develop in a vacuum. That seems obvious regardless of which definition you choose. Obviously, it doesn't just pop out of nowhere, but that they're products of social, political, and economic factors. You take that as obvious, despite the fact that we tend to fall into things like instrumentalism or technological determinism. I think an example, which is probably the most famous example, is the development of the bicycle in the 19th century, right? So the design of bicycles evolved as a response to both social and cultural preferences. We can't just take the bicycle as we see it today as given. That's how it was birthed, right? The high wheel penny farthing bicycle, the one with the big wheel at the front, right?
Yeah.
Which was incredibly popular, particularly amongst men, right? Because that was like a status symbol. It's like, look how cool I am. I'm sitting, 2.5 meters high. It's crazily dangerous, right? Really hard to steer, really hard to get on and get off of, right? That was eventually gradually replaced by the safety bicycle, the bicycle that we know now with most bicycles. I think the vast majority have the front and rear wheels are the same size, right? And that was due to its broader appeal and ease of use, obviously, but particularly amongst women. The way they dressed permitted, well, it was more modest, but it was more modest to ride a safety
Lower,
bicycle
yeah, sure.
rather than a penny farthing, which are 2 meters above the ground, right? Obviously, much easier to get on and off of. It's much safer. So the shift in design was driven by societal demands for safer, more accessible transportation options, not by some intrinsic technological superiority. But like I said, each of these narratives maybe compensates for the other, but by doing so tends to overcompensate and then thereby becoming reductionistic, simple, right? Complex problem, complex solution, not simple solution. So I think that social constructivism, I think, obviously highlights the influence of human agency. That's a good example. Uh, but it may underestimate what you said, the material constraints of technology. So not all technological designs are equally feasible or even effective. Some technologies may shape human behaviors in ways that were not even foreseen by its creators. And that's why I propose the interactionalist narrative, right? So that takes what I would say are the truths, the parts that we actually see effectively in the world from the more simplistic reductionistic narratives and puts them together. It's the view that I advocate in the book, and it recognizes that technology and society co-create one another. So
Mm-hmm.
it integrates aspects of all three perspectives by acknowledging that while technologies are shaped by social context, they also have the power to shape those contexts in return. So let's use a high-tech example, the smartphone, right? Smartphones were developed in response to a social demand for portable, multifunctional communication devices, not just calling. It has to have more than one function. Once introduced, they fundamentally transformed how we communicated, right? It didn't just remain static the way it was before, right? It's not like we just gave you more functions. It actually changed the way we communicate, the way we access information, and even the way we perceive time and space. So they've led to new social behaviors like constant connectivity, for example, that have influenced social norms around availability and attention. Think about the concept of, clocking out of work. That's not in many domains. There is no clocking out. You have a cell phone. You've given your cell phone number. You have your email that's connected 24/7. You can be reached at all times. There's no excuse, right? The way notifications are set up, they are specifically designed that vibration frequency, that perfect sound, the little red icon with the number. It's meant to attract as much attention as possible, right? At the same time, user feedback and societal reactions continue to shape the development of smartphone technologies, like through the demand for better privacy features, for example, or even screen time management tools. So, how much time I'm actually spending on certain apps, the ability to reduce the amount of screen time that I spend on certain apps. This, I think, has at least a few benefits. So, it provides a more holistic understanding of technology by considering a continuous feedback loop between society and technology. And it helps us see technologies not as merely tools or determinants, but as part of a complex network of relationships, which involves obviously people, institutions, and other technologies, right? So there is, like you touched on that certain truth of determinism, that there is a determining factor. Of course, there is. The infrastructure, technology is best looked at as an infrastructure, not as an isolated artifact. It's interconnected. And
Mm.
by doing so, it opens up or it closes down potential future options for future designers, right? So the fact that the microprocessor won out in comparison to previous versions or competitors means that it's almost certain that that will determine the future adoption of that technology in other technologies, right? Because technologies form, as an infrastructure, form a scaffolding, right? It's not like we see many super revolutions within technology. We see evolutions, and those evolutions naturally are built on previous iterations, which to a certain degree constrain the possible outcomes of future iterations.
Yeah, I think I don't know if this was in the book or if I read this elsewhere, but I was reading. Well, you'll know quickly if it was in the book. But there were some issues with when they were starting to provide smartphones to third world countries. Was that in the book?
No.
Okay, well, it was really interesting that they I don't know where I read this, but they were running into issues because there was a some impetus to start providing smartphones to people in in third world countries, and they were running into issues because the technologies that they chose to give were actually harming those peoples, either because they were lower quality and they weren't holding up, so they were requiring more um, fixes or repairs, and then those people were sort of dependent on those technologies that then they didn't have, or because they were lower security because there was less, people were less worried about that, and they actually gave rise to illegal activity and
Mm.
hacking and stealing of stuff. So it's I think it's just like one of those examples where the deployment of a technology has to be thought through. I think you used the idea of a stakeholder model, and so like looking at who stands to gain or lose from the technology is super important, uh, and doing the best you can to foresee the various stakeholders and what they stand to gain or lose seems to be critical in this process.
Yeah, in the book, I talk about ethics by design, right? Rather than it means integrating ethical considerations, doing ethical considerations into the design process from the very beginning, rather than waiting for something to go wrong and then going, why did it go
Yeah,
wrong?
I've
What
got
could
a
we have
quote
done
from you.
better?
I wrote down a quote which might well, you can probably just say it as well as you did here, but in the book you say what this means is that we reframe our ethical theorizing to focus on how design choices shape the contexts in which individual choices are made, and how the options available to individuals are expanded or limited by prior design choices.
It's because one of the insights that has emerged within the philosophy of technology from the design turn, because there's various turns in let's just call them traditions within the philosophy of technology. The most recent turn, which is the one that's been adopted, for example, my book is essentially kind of like a summary, an abstract of what the design turn in applied ethics is, and that is if we doing ethics by design, right? Rather than evaluate doing like technology analysis, we just grab like a case study and then we ethically evaluate it based on some sort of ethical system. We're actually doing ethics by doing design, right?
Right.
And practically, this can be applied through various methodologies like participatory design or universal design, or the approach that I tend to think is probably most comprehensive value sensitive design, where stakeholders, like you mentioned, including groups or stakeholders that are often not considered during the design process, are involved in the design process. So, for instance, when designing AI systems, we ensure that data used is representative of the people that would eventually potentially interact with the technology to help mitigate the biases that may emerge to ensure a more distributed, fair outcomes.
Yeah. So this bumps into an idea. Now you're in Italy right now,
That's
right?
right.
Where are you from?
I'm Canadian. I'm
Okay.
from
All
Toronto.
right. So you might kind of have a little bit of this, but in America, like the highest realm of goodness, of virtue, which I definitely disagree with, is freedom, right? This idea that I should be free to do whatever I want. There are more guns than people in America. Um,
That libertinism, that's essentially what they mean by when people, aside from the fact that everyone uses the term differently and they appropriate it to whatever's most convenient to them at the time, right?
yeah, right, exactly. And I mean, and the example I've always, I've always given to someone like that because I'm kind of I don't think freedom is a virtue at all, to be honest. But you'd you'd appreciate the opportunity not to be free, right? To inhibit your freedoms to things that harm you. So if I'm not free to do something that hurts me, that's a benefit to me, right? But I think what you'll run into, on this side of the pond, is people saying, "Well, I don't want my technology to be constrained. I don't want my choices to be limited." And I think that's part of the practical conversation that's happening about social media and things like that.
Well, to a
So do
degree,
you have
they don't have a choice. Like I said, the very architecture of the system will constrain you. You can use a spoon to eat soup or to kill someone if you're skilled enough, right?
you're ambitious enough, sure.
If you're ambitious enough, but you'll have a very hard time eating soup with a gun. The very architecture of the design itself really does constrain things. So you can't have this absolute total libertarian notion of freedom in every possible technology. It's it's not logically impossible. If not, it's probably close to that. But
Yeah.
it's practically impossible.
Yeah. I think that's a really um like you said before the technology is adopted widely, it's great for those sorts of conversations, but I think that's what we're running into now when the technology is already established and we're trying to rein it in and prevent some of the negativity that comes from it. You're going to have people objecting and being like, the whole free speech debate, for instance, on Twitter or
Sure.
something like that, where where those issues now run up against already established conceptions of what the technology is and what it should be doing. So yeah, I just think that's a really it's sticky, I guess.
Like for example, yeah, those are probably the same people that would be, because although I would say I'd probably be on the side of more free speech is better than less free speech, only from a practical side effect. Because first of all, I'm of the mind that the protection of free speech is to protect the speech that you don't want to hear, not the one that you want to hear. If you want
Sure.
to
No,
hear
I agree
that,
with that.
there's no need to protect it because everyone's already in agreement, right? But that being said, it's just because of my skepticism of the people who are most likely to control what speech is allowed or not are the people that I would least want to be able to decide what I can and cannot say. But
Absolutely.
from a principled perspective, I'm not a free speech absolutist that in every single case possible. It's just because to a large degree, I'm ignorant of the potential things that could feasibly be said. And I'm not 100% sure that everything that could be said should be said.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of interesting to look around and see what sort of ideas are gaining in popularity because of the internet culture. Like, who would have predicted that flat eartherism would be a thing, or certain like conspiracy theories? Who would have thought that there would be serious adherence? But I think another issue is just that the social media and internet sort of amplifies things that aren't necessarily very popular. So, we know about flat earthers, but do you know any actual flat earthers?
Not
I don't
one.
think. Yeah. So I know there are people who believe that, the Third Reich will rise again, but, you know, it's not that much of a socially significant, uh, you know, issue. So it
The,
might.
the people that tend to be amplified on social media tend to be the ones that say the most obnoxious or abhorrent things, and that's exactly the reason why they're amplified. And they tend to be a very small group of very loud people, and that's why you're able to see in the technology is like a megaphone in that way. You can game the algorithm, or the algorithm by its very designers can be gamed, and we've seen how people are what you call shadow banned, for example, if they're part of, or they even associate with certain other people, right? Kind of like a social credit system,
Yeah,
an
sure.
social credit system, which, oh, you associated with this person, therefore you may not appear on the algorithm even to your own followers, right? So the very designers behind the fact may have complicated so much many of these social media algorithms that they themselves have very little understanding of exactly the way it works. Right? It's kind of they made it black box themselves, but to a large degree they exert a disproportionate amount of control over the kind of people that they disproportionately amplify. Right? So your
Yeah, I,
intuition is pretty good on that. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting point that I know almost nothing about coding, but if you look at, um, I've looked at what it looks like, the actual physical code, and you can just scroll for hours just on
It's
on
very
whatever simple
transparent,
thing,
but that
right?
doesn't mean it's explicable, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like at some point, you've created this monolith of a thing that it works because you keep patching it, you keep building on it. But to say that Mark Zuckerberg knows what's going on in that machine, like that's probably saying too much.
It, it's not unprecedented. Most of what we consider to be knowledge is not some sort of imminent insight that we have. We don't. We essentially take most of what we consider knowledge is nothing other than belief, right? Like, how do you know that the United States, right, is the demarcation lines of each state is exactly where you see it on the map, right? Did you draw the
Yeah,
map
sure.
yourself? No. Do you know the person who drew the map? No. Do each person who drew each of the state lines know the other people who drew the other state lines? Each one builds on the next, right? Until we come into what's called common sense. That's essentially it's like a pool of collective implicit knowledge that we take for granted, right?
Right.
And although we call it knowledge as if it were some sort of deductive argument that's airtight, it's absolutely not that. It's mostly inductive, and we take it as a matter of belief, not as a matter of fact.
Yeah, that's
And
right. I think
that's a good analogy, I think, for many of these gigantic monolithic coding infrastructures, like you said, that underlie the things that we use every day, all day long, social media.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that that stretches further to the sort of the issues is that w- people are not inclined, and maybe people never were, but at least today, people aren't necessarily inclined to sort of anchor their beliefs in reality, or at least anchor their, or at least do the work to make sure that everything is kind of founded in something true, and that that sort of just raises the level of troublesome thoughts that can be out
That,
there.
that kind of discernment is difficult. It's not like we're although we may have an internal sense of what the good is or what the true is, right? It still requires a certain degree of we need to be attentive to the matters of fact, to our senses. We need to be intelligent in the way we come to have insights. We need to be reasonable in how we make our judgments, and then we need to be responsible in how we make decisions based on those judgments. And that's a lot of work to do that.
Yeah,
Like
I
it
mean,
is this.
there's a psychological component to it as well. I think we're pretty much um, confirmation bias machines. If you have a belief, you're going to more readily accept other facts that corroborate that belief.
It requires a lot of work to, first of all, even accept the fact that your belief could be wrong, even if you, I guess you could say you could be willfully blind in knowing that your belief is wrong, but because you're conscious of the amount of work it would take to reconstruct the right belief, right, in its place.
And
Uh,
there's also, your friends and your family all believe the same thing. It's an alienating force.
sure.
There's a lot of issues, yeah. So one of the things that kind of was swimming around my head as I was reading is the it probably isn't the right word, but I'll use the word the enforcement mechanism of of the system that you're advocating. It appears to me that good people will do it, right, and then people who are more unscrupulous just won't. And I know that there might be sort of economic consequences, right? If someone creates a car that explodes, they're gonna get sued and stuff like that. But what's besides the goodwill of mankind, right? What's the force that's going to ensure that that these ethical decisions are actually implemented?
I think that probably the best, I probably don't have the capacity to give a comprehensive, airtight answer, but I think my intuition is that, and I think it plays out in the real world. We've seen it play out, for example, with companies like Volvo, for example, that make the safest cars and always win awards for that, is to sell essentially to the power players, the designers. We know that most technologies aren't made by someone in their garage, right? They're made by big tech, right? Is to sell to them the fact that monetary value, so that's shareholder profit, right? Quarterly earnings, expenses, losses, revenue, don't are not only not incompatible or contradictory or come at the opportunity cost of moral values, but can be augmented, are complementary to, can increase as a consequence of integrating, promoting important moral values. How often do we see even new types of AI come out? God knows how much money was spent in R&D, for example, like Google with their facial recognition tech, right? Then it can't recognize people with certain skin tones, right? And then it has to just be
Yeah.
scuttled. God knows how much money was spent building those kinds of systems, right? If if they took even, I would say, 3 minutes of time to use a tool like the envisioning cards, which are a simple set of cards in four suits: time, pervasiveness, values, and stakeholders, to think about how how are technologies distributed across time and space, and what impacts may they have on people in the environment. Who are the people that may be involved? What happens if a child gets their hands on this technology? Stakeholders, right? What happens when a technology becomes so ubiquitous that it becomes pervasive, like the cell phone, right? The smartphone, in which you can't just do a recall on everyone's iPhone, right? That's nearly impossible. So how do we take into account things like updating a system when some sort of recalcitrant behavior emerges, right? Um, and then what are the values that are at play? Are certain values more applicable than others? What happens when we have too many moral values that we want to satisfy in a technology? How do we create a hierarchy of those values? How do design requirements satisfy or not satisfy those values, right? Like I said, if you tried to make a gun be useful to eating soup, you would really have a hard time. That's probably not a really, that kind of utility is probably not a value you could probably integrate into that technology, right? So it'd be really on the bottom of the hierarchies list, right? But even a gun like, for example, the 1911, when it was birthed, it didn't have the safety mechanisms that it does today, right? It has a grip safety. It's unique in that. Other guns have it now, but that was one of the first, if not the first, handgun that has a grip safety. You need to have a certain hand size in order to squeeze the grip before the trigger can be actuated. And that was put into place because after the First World War, when sergeants or officers who were the ones that were permitted to have the 1911 brought it home, a lot of their kids, particularly their sons, who were males, tend to be more interested in things than in people, particularly at a young age. That when they would see their dad's gun, unfortunately, accidents would happen. There were many
Sure.
unintentional suicides, right? They would hurt themselves or kill themselves. So in order, they created a safe by design, right? So in the design itself, that in order for it to be actuated, in order to use the technology, you have to have an adult's hand size, right? In order to wrap your hands around the grip in such a way where you can depress the grip safety, which would then actuate the trigger, right? So these things don't necessarily come at opportunity cost. It's just kind of like a tradition that these kinds of values tend to come at the opportunity cost of economic value, so out of a profit. But just look at a company like Volvo, which has the success that it does and wins all the awards that it does, and therefore has more shareholder profit in the end, because they make the safest cars on the market, and that technology costs more money, costs more R&D, right? But their investment in that, realizing that that's a value that people really do care about, that they were willing to do that, and then they have that return on investment, right? So it's looking at these moral values as an investment that will have a disproportional return on. I think that that's a good first step.
Sure. Based on your sort of, your knowledge of the whole scene, I know you're probably on the academic side, but w do big companies have these like technology ethicists on staff? Like, does that exist?
Um, yes. Unfortunately, I would say the vast majority of those who hold that kind of title, because those titles do exist, right? And you can, I'm not going to name names, but you could find the very, very big tech guys and the consulting firms for many of these big tech corporations, in which on their boards or on their paid staff have people that have ethical or ethicists in the title. Functionally, effectively, they're there. This is my experience based on the literature. It's not always the case. That's why I'm making my comment conditional, in the sense that in the vast majority of cases, it's kind of an ethics washing. It's like, look at, we're doing good, right? It's kind of like a mark of approval, right? Google tried to create an ethics board, and they actually like got all the names on the board, and then it quickly dissolved, right? It's probably one of the reasons
Huh.
why Google, yeah, maybe you know their original model. You remember their original model, what it used to be? It was "Don't be
Mm.
evil." That's not their model anymore. They just got
Oh,
rid of that.
really? Was
Yeah,
that
it was "Don't
stated?
be evil." They got rid of that. I don't know why, but I guess it's self-explanatory, right? I'm not sure that one of the largest companies in the world, whose model was "Don't be evil," getting rid of it is incredibly conducive to being earnest in creating an ethics board, or having someone with the title of design or tech ethicists actually having real choice and power within the company, right?
Yeah, that's funny. That's almost like that would be unheard of today. You know, if that were like someone's motto,
Yeah, don't be
it's
evil. Yeah,
the sign of change of the times, I guess. But
it's also probably
maybe it made
because
sense then.
my intuition is that the vast majority of the people that work in that company are effectively moral relativists. So, and when you make such a declarative statement like "don't be evil," you're already creating like a reference for absolute good and absolute evil, right?
Yeah,
That's
that
just an
doesn't go well
intuition.
with. Yeah, huh? That's interesting. Yeah. So, I kind of want to branch off to a couple other things, but is there anything
Sure.
else that you wanted to
No, no,
touch
no. Go
on with the
ahead.
book?
You just have a free flowing combo. Yeah, yeah.
Sure. So I know that that part of your focus has been on AI, and particularly a um, a certain theology of, or rather, maybe applying certain theology to the field. The first question I think that you've answered. What are your large, big picture, maybe predictions for what AI is going to be and what the implications are going to be?
Okay, so first, and this is probably the most difficult part, is what is AI? You kind of mentioned already at the beginning, kind of like a buzz, it's a buzzword, right? And people, we tend to use, it's kind of like falling into one of those narratives that I talked about. We tend, everything's AI. In fact, that's like a selling point now. It's like, this is
Right.
powered by AI. It's like,
Yeah.
what does that mean? Most people probably don't know. It's a very complex artificial intelligence system that runs elevators, right? You don't really think about that too much, but it's actually a quite complex system that functions on what we would technically call artificial intelligence to simply go up and down different levels, right?
Hmm.
But I think that we could probably come up with a rudimentary, let's call it a working definition of AI, right? So when we're talking about AI, we're always talking about the field of computer science and tech, right? Which is focused on creating systems, machines, whether they're digital or whether they're embodied, kind of like in robots, right? Which are capable of performing tasks that typically require human intelligence. So that's things like learning from data, recognizing patterns, solving problems, understanding natural language. You know, ChatGPT, you type in a sentence, it understands. We use that word colloquially. It shouldn't be
Sure.
understood in the way that humans are, at least that's from my perspective. And it makes decisions. So these systems can be designed to operate with varying degrees of autonomy, and they can be implemented in different forms. Like I said, software programs, the more digital kind of stuff, right? Something you see on your phone, or robotic systems, or embedded devices, right? You know, like smart tech. So unlike simple automation, just automation, what AI tries to do is try to simulate, that's the important word, parts or aspects of our human cognition, like perception, reasoning, the ability to adapt to novel situations. But I don't think that it possesses what a lot of people want it to possess, not that it
Sure.
does, want the consciousness or self awareness, because that already implicates that you have a good understanding or total understanding of a theory of mind, right? In order
Which we have
to,
no idea. I mean, consciousness is basically like you said, a black box. I mean, it's we don't know anything about it.
yeah, now there's the argument that, well, you can create consciousness even if you don't understand what it is, just like you can make a plane fly but it doesn't fly like a bird, nothing flies like a plane, right? Or we created a different way of doing the same thing, but that's a really functional way of looking at consciousness. I think that consciousness goes way beyond that. That's just an aspect of consciousness, right?
Hmm.
So you asked me, um, in terms of future developments of AI, in terms of society. Is that the question that you wanted me to answer?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, sure. Let's start there.
Sure. I think I think probably most simply put, I think that AI, obviously, effectively, we see it, can enhance human capabilities. It can assist in a wide variety of tasks. Uh, but there's a risk of over relying on systems that don't share, that don't embody our values or our understanding. So I think ethically, we have to be cautious, right? Not to attribute human qualities to machines. We have a tendency to anthropomorphize quite a bit in general. Even when you're talking to ChatGPT, you talk to it like a person, right?
Yeah,
And we have to carefully discern, consider the implications of integrating AI into decision-making process that effectively will have an impact on human lives. So you can just think about like the medical field, for example, right? So AI systems can and do assist in diagnosing diseases by looking carefully at medical images, but they obviously lack that kind of empathy, that ethical judgment that is required for patient care. That's part of
sure.
cura care. That's you need that empathy, you need that ability to discern, right? Human emotion, right? So if we start to rely too heavily on AI for decisions that require this kind of nuanced understanding of human well-being, I think that we risk undermining the very essence of human-centered care when we're talking about something like the medical field. So it's once again falling into a techno-optimistic or techno-pessimistic narrative. Once again, is the same thing of like falling into a purely instrumental or purely deterministic or purely constructivistic narrative. It's just you're capturing a part of it. That part of it is almost certainly true, um, and that's what makes it attractive and adopted by a lot of people. But in putting on those narrow goggles, you miss the forest for the trees.
Sure. Yeah, I like what you said with well, sort of like the fact that AI, however you want to define it, has been around for a while. In fact, this was I think I heard this in a podcast somewhere. There was a tech guy saying that AI has been they've tried to roll it out many different times. I think it was once in the 80s, as far
Yeah,
back as
there
the
was
80s.
multiple AI winters, they're
Yeah.
called. So there's the
Yeah,
summers of
yeah.
AI, and then there's the winters of AI.
Right. And so what he was saying was that it was to the point where um there was the peak of this wave where everyone was putting AI and stuff, and then actually stocks would go down when the people were mentioning AI because they're like, oh, it doesn't work, right? Or it's not doing what we thought it was going to do.
Exactly.
And
You just hit the nail on the head. It's not doing what we thought it was going to do. So AI winters, and people are already talking about the high probability of us entering into another AI winter because there are probably less discerning scholars and researchers that tend to overhype the potential promises for AI and then under deliver on those promises. And that makes investors, that's what's
right,
fundamentally required for this kind of stuff, to get really nervous about continuing to invest, right?
right. Well, there's very little profit in a lot of these companies. I mean, they're not making money; they're losing money. Um, but like the analog that this guy gave was the touch screen. The touchscreen technology existed for a long time, in really long time, and it wasn't until there was this kind of convergence of the technology and some kind of useful implementation of technology. I think probably the iPhone or the i,
Yeah, those are
those.
called enabling technologies. So one techno because like I said, this is why we have to be very careful about the narratives we choose. That technologies don't develop in isolation; they develop on scaffolding, right? They're architectures, and because of that, they're fundamentally, inextricably enmeshed, connected with the other technologies that are also scaffolding, right? Building on previous iterations. And in many cases, these technologies converge and enable one another to actually function at their peak capacity, we could say, right? For
Right.
example, there was at the beginning of the 2000s, there was a huge nanotechnology hype, right? It's going to change everything, particularly medicine, little nanobots that go into your
Yeah,
system. But
cleaning out your
how do you
heart. Yeah.
navigate those, right? People are
Right.
saying maybe we need something like artificial intelligence that will enable those kinds of very, very delicate, atomically precise manufacturing technologies to create the kind of microelectronics that would have that would be efficacious within the human body and be safe,
Sure.
right? We can't navigate those little things ourselves manually. We need something that we can delegate that to, and that would be something like AI. But in 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 lieu of AI, how would we do that? So there's right now we find ourselves, what are we? We're in 2024, almost 2025, kind of like 15 years within a nanotechnology winter, in which yes, there is nanotech research, but those like really science fiction narratives that were really hyped about the promises of nanotech simply haven't panned out. And maybe it's going to be something like AI that enables that tech, right?
Right. And it appears that for AI, the large language models, namely ChatGPT, was sort of the impetus for the explosion because people could literally get on their computer and talk to this thing and get these answers that were just astonishing.
Sure.
Um,
But
and
you had other
so,
technologies that enabled it, right? Your PC, your home PC,
sure,
the, the easy access to high speed internet, right? In many cases, probably a large majority of people are now are using it on their phones, right? So, and ChatGPT also then becomes an enabling technology as it becomes integrated into other applications, right?
yeah, yeah, and I think that's what people are struggling is, okay, let's how do we integrate this into something that makes money? So
Sure, sure.
I think if they fail to do that, then there's going to be trouble anyway, because of the large costs of running these things.
Yeah. The number of servers, the amount of energy that's consumed per prompt, right? There are people who even do calculations on how much energy is consumed per prompt, right? The number of prompts per day, the number of prompts per month, per year, and then you could calculate the amount of energy that's consumed simply from just ChatGPT. And the more it becomes ubiquitous, right? Because this is called the pervasiveness of technology. That it's called the Calling Ridge dilemma, right? So the dilemma with technology, Calling Ridge said, is that we don't know the impacts of a technology until it's released and becomes ubiquitous. But the moment it becomes released and therefore
It's
ubiquitous,
too
it's
late.
impossible to bring it back and make the changes we need, right? So it's kind of like, what do we do? And something like ChatGPT, which has like an API that people can use and integrate into other apps, right? Is that it's become exponential. So now you have a lot of other people, businesses, applications, domains of application that are dependent on this other technology, right? If ChatGPT disappeared today, right, it wouldn't be ChatGPT that disappeared. It would be ChatGPT and everything else built on it because technologies are not in isolation. They are a scaffolding. Knock the legs off a scaffolding from a building and watch the rest of the scaffolding that was built on top of it fall.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. It's gonna be strange to see how it plays out, especially if the money doesn't come in. People are going to be, like you said, they're used to. I mean, I do a lot of my internet searching with ChatGPT now rather than
Yeah,
going to Google. So people are getting used to these technologies that are going to have to find a way to survive, I guess, or adapt to, you know, either being more useful or being more financially useful. I don't know. But part of um the study that you do is sort of in regards to anthropology, um, and AI. So, to what extent can AI become human, um, achieve sentience, or some level of however you want to say it. How
sure.
can we
So
can
it's
we
the thing
create?
about strong AI, essentially. Once AI surpasses, not to a large degree, it's already surpassed our ability to do very specific things. But the dream is that many AGI researchers, that's artificial general intelligence, that right now AI is very good at doing a very specific thing better than a human. But the goal is to make AI do everything better than anything anybody could do, right?
Sure.
And that's essentially that the dream of artificial general intelligence. Then there's some people that are already discussing AI rights. We don't even give rights to people, let alone think about giving rights to robots. But that's a nuanced discussion as well. You have people like David Gunko, for example, that talks about rights for robots in a more sophisticated, legalistic way, the kind of way we give rights of persons to things like enterprises, right? To corporations, right? That kind of corporate personhood. So that's a more nuanced way of looking at the discussion. But in general, you're touching on the idea: can AI become human? And in fact, it's not released yet, but people should keep an eye out for it sometime next year. Me and Paul O'Hara. Paul is a mathematician right now at Sofia University here in Italy, but he was chair of the Department of Mathematics for many years. I believe it was Northeastern. Okay. And in our book, which is tentatively called Why AI Can Never Be Human, what we try to explore is the idea that no matter how advanced AI becomes. Fundamentally, it lacks the essence of human consciousness. And we give a definition to what human consciousness is. And obviously, definitions aren't the thing itself, but we can capture, I think, what consciousness is in a not necessarily purely functional way. And what I think it's characterized by a few things. So self-awareness, intentionality, and the ability to reflect on our own experiences and existence. AI, on the other hand, operates on programmed algorithms and data processing. It doesn't matter how complex a system is. Doesn't matter if it's using machine learning, deep learning, neural networks, hybridization. Fundamentally, you could break it down to binary code. So while it could simulate certain aspects of human behavior, I think that it lacks the genuine understanding and the experiential depth that comes and that defines being human. So, for instances, when a human experiences joy or sorrow, it's not just a set of responses to external stimuli. It's not something so simple as that, right?
Right.
It's tied to a deep subjective sense of self and an ongoing narrative of personal identity across space and time. So
Sure.
AI can definitely mimic these reactions, but without any real understanding or subjective experience. So, for example, you probably heard of the AI Sophia, right? Which was in the newspapers because the robot was given personhood or citizenship in Saudi Arabia, right? It was made by Hanson Robotics. Sophia can exhibit expressions that might seem human-like, but her responses are pre-programmed, or even if it's using something like unsupervised learning, right? She still lacks that she fall into the kind of the anthropomorphization. The
Sure.
robot lacks the
Yeah.
self-awareness, the personal history that makes human emotions, right? That ability to look within oneself, that interiority meaningful. Sophia doesn't know what it's like to genuinely feel joy or pain, which are integral, not only not only epiphenomenological of human conscious, right?
Right.
It's
It's not
integral.
accidental property.
It's
Yeah.
not accidental, right? It's not just some sort of accidental phenotype. It's integral to what human consciousness is, right? So people, when they talk about this, they bring up things like the Turing test, right? Its limitations. People, ChatGPT already passed the Turing test, right? So for people who don't know what that is, for your listeners who don't know what the Turing test is, uh, Alan Turing proposed, and he suggested that if a machine can engage in a conversation indistinguishably from a human being, it could be considered intelligent, human like human, right? However, the test only measures a machine's ability to mimic human
Yeah.
behavior,
Sure.
not to experience or to understand. True human intelligence is not only about responding correctly, right? We can all memorize even answers, right? Or respond as if we knew what the hell we're talking about, right? I do it all the time. I pretend like I know what I'm talking about. I don't know. I have no genuine understanding, right? Um, Real, genuine human intelligence involves insight, spontaneous understanding, right, of the creation of models in one's mind. The eureka of Archimedes when he understood buoyancy, right? How to measure volume, creativity, a personal sense of identity. AI can definitely simulate conversational skills. We know that anyone who uses ChatGPT knows that AI can simulate very well conversational skills, but it doesn't have that experience that informs human understanding. ChatGPT can generate text that seems coherent, contextually appropriate, but it lacks that any real, not just some, any real comprehension of its content. It doesn't know
Sure.
what it's talking about, right? It's like a sophisticated parrot capable of repeating patterns, but without understanding the meaning or implications, right? A parrot has their stories convince people that it's actually a human when they don't see that it's actually a parrot because it can mimic so well what humans do, right? But it's not like it understands what it's saying, right? Its meaning, its implications. And that's a fundamental limitation of the Turing test. It can be passed by systems that have no real awareness or understanding, right? And that's because we also have the capability of what Bernard Lonergan, he's a Canadian philosopher, theologian, Jesuit theologian that I study, what he calls inverse insight. And inverse insight refers to recognizing what is not understood or identifying the limitations of a particular framework of understanding. So humans have the capacity to realize when their conceptual tools are inadequate and can question their assumptions underlying those tools.
Right. To know
And
what you
this
don't know.
capacity for
Right.
self correction, for deeper questioning, is something that AI lacked because it can't go beyond its predefined parameters. The code is law, right?
Sure.
So, take for instance the concept of irrational numbers in mathematics. So, the Pythagoreans initially believed that all numbers were rational. It was only through the realization of contradictions within their own system that they grasped the concept of irrational numbers. And this ability to transcend existing frameworks, recognize their limitations, is a distinctive human capability that AI can't replicate. AI can process data, follow algorithms, but it doesn't have the capacity to see beyond the rules that govern its system, its very architecture. We can transcend by our very nature those limitations, right? They're not real limitations; they're apparent limitations, but to an AI system, they are real limitations, right? So I don't think that AI can ever possess true creativity, original thought, these things that are integral to human experience, right? Creativity involves more than just recombining existing elements in novel ways, which is things like what ChatGPT does, right? It requires an understanding of context, of purpose, intent, the ability to reflect on, transcend current paradigms. AI obviously can generate what we call novel outputs based on patterns and data, but it doesn't understand the significance or meaning of those outputs. True creativity is a product of human consciousness, that self-awareness that I mentioned, intentionality. It's fundamental to what it means to be human. So AI generated art is an excellent example. AI can produce images, music that may be aesthetically pleasing. Maybe we've never heard something exactly like it before, but it lacks that ability to imbue its creation with meaning, with intention. When a human artist paints a picture, they're not just combining colors and shapes, they're trying to convey emotions,
Mm.
experience, personal perspective. AI generated art lacks that depth of intentionality, of personal expression.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think one of the sort of the symptoms of this is that a lot of the people in this field are very naturalistic or materialistic, and they see the human brain as a machine. So they see it as, just a it's the same thing, just made out of different properties. This is flesh and organic material,
Yeah,
and this is a
it's not so
computer.
surprising. If you start with materialism, it's no wonder that that's going to be your output, right? In terms of theory.
Right. So it's also interesting to hear some people talk about AI where, the sort of doom and gloom that, for us would be like this AI overlord. Some people are welcoming that. They're like, oh yeah, like the AI are going to tell us what we need. Like they're going to be our
Yeah, that's
gods.
called algocracy, governance via algorithm.
And that's not a that's a real thought that people are having. And I mean, I've seen it, in some popular circumstances that I really wonder about that. Why that's I mean, I guess, you don't have a God, you're going to make one, I guess.
There are no real atheists, right? They're all dead. They kill themselves, right? Because everyone has a summum bonum, right? The highest good. That's the reason why, Albert Camus, I don't agree with him, but he was definitely right that the most important philosophical question is suicide. It's like, why not just kill yourself? It's because fundamentally, he says that meaning is doing whatever you're doing that stops you from killing yourself, right? That's your summum bonum. Even if it changes from moment to moment, you have a highest good towards which you are moving, right? Being static is the same thing as being dead, right? So
Hmm.
I think that's an important existential element to take into consideration, is that many of the discussions on AI start with materialism, which I think that
That's
that's
right.
that's
Yeah.
already starting from the wrong point of view.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. Now, I think one of the I don't, maybe not mistakes, right? But one of the considerations I've always had when applying theology to particularly the advancement of science is that we sort of constrain maybe artificial constraints of what the world looks like based on our imperfect assessment of the Bible, for instance. So I think like heliocentrism is an example of that. We certain readings of the Bible would say, okay, the earth is fixed and the sun goes around the earth. I think we're seeing developments of that with origins. You know, people are, you know, we're Christians were very sure for a certain time that the earth was 6,000 years old, and now that's being contested. So I the only trepidation I have is by saying, you know, based on this theology, this thing is impossible. And then once that threshold gets kind of passed, sort of retconning and being okay, now it's possible. So I'm always more careful to leave room for possibilities when they're mm, when they're not, in my opinion, you know, prohibited by my beliefs. So as it comes to, you know, this sort of human esque situation, I do I guess I wouldn't close it off completely, but my first thought actually is if we were ever to create something with sentience, like I would feel sort of bad for that thing. You know, human beings have a really awful tendency to really screw up whatever they touch.
I would say that's a
Um,
good instinct. If you saw something that at least simulated being in pain, for example, because sentience is simply feeling, right? If you didn't have that kind of reaction, that's a good indicator of sociopathy, right?
yeah, yeah. So like I mean as far as the science and the computer science and stuff, I what do I know, right? But I just hate to see Christians getting caught flat-footed on these things and saying, oh, it's impossible, and then all of a sudden
Mm.
here it is.
You have to approach it with, well, first of all, I think that's impossible technically. So it's not, I don't start with the theology in terms of saying why it's impossible, although you can then
Sure.
use the theology to arrive or to buttress the same conclusion. I think technically it's impossible because first of all, the people who are saying AI can be conscious don't even say what consciousness is. And
Right.
I think that by definition, consciousness is particularly human, right? And then you can give also a theological understanding of consciousness, which therefore excludes any other type of consciousness. But that would just be a misappropriation of the term to something that simply can't, by definition, can't satisfy. But like I said, regardless of what kind of AI system you use, it doesn't matter how fast it is, it doesn't matter how much computer power you put behind it, right? It doesn't matter its problem solving capabilities. It doesn't matter which system you use, you can break it down to binary code. You
Hmm.
cannot do that with humans. So we can come to. I'll try not to be complex as possible, but I approach um, the study AI. People who eventually will see the book that I mentioned, "Why AI Can Never Be Human," come out. They'll see that we appropriate Bernard Lonergan's cognitional theory in order to talk about AI, right? So particularly his exploration of human understanding and this concept of insight. It's a cornerstone of the argument that human cognition transcends, by definition, mere information processing, just processing info, right? So, in his seminal, extremely difficult, very dense work, Insight, a Study of Human Understanding, he outlines a multi level process of human knowing that involves experience, understanding, judgment, and decision, each in various levels, right? This process is inherently self reflective, it sublates the previous steps, right? Understanding sublates experience, judgment sublates understanding and experience, and decision sublates all three, right? It involves this dynamic interaction between the knower and what is known, right? So, what relevance does that have to AI? So, his concept of insight, this spontaneous creative act of understanding, contrasts sharply, inevitably, incommensurably with AI's algorithmic processing. AI systems can simulate problem solving, but don't
Sure.
possess the ability to have genuine insights because they lack the intentionality and self awareness, which are by definition necessary in order to have insights. Lonergan has this emphasis on self appropriation, which is the act of reflecting on one's own cognitive processing. So I'm reflecting on my fact that I'm perceiving, on understanding. I had that eureka, right? That comes at times that are unexpected, right? That's something that AI lacks, right? AI can analyze data patterns. It can't reflect on its own thought processes in a way that involves understanding and consciousness. So uh, I'm adopting what is by definition a Catholic anthropology, just by mere fact that Lonergan was a Jesuit theologian. But it's not that something that's particularly Catholic in this cognitional theory. But I think that if we take Catholic anthropology, which is the anthropology that I lean on, right, and I think that I can make a good argument for, offers a vision of the human person that's deeply rooted, fundamentally, inextricably, again, rooted in the belief that humans are created in the imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God, right? And this perspective, I think, by 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 virtue of it being that way, has several key attributes of human nature that are fundamentally impossible, that are absent in AI. So Catholic thought affirms, by definition, the intrinsic dignity of every human being, right? Because they're made in the imago Dei, they're endowed with free will, the capacity for moral decision making. And this is inextricably different from AI, which operates deterministically, even if it's using deep learning, even if it's using machine learning, right? Supervised or unsupervised, based on its programming, and then lacks that true autonomy or moral agency, which are delimited by the code. Code is law, it restrains that. There is no full autonomy or real moral agency, right? And then there's Catholic anthropology, I think, posits that human beings are oriented towards transcendence, that summum bonum,
Mm-hmm.
meaning
Mm-hmm.
that they have an innate capacity, a desire to seek meaning, right? To seek truth, and ultimately a relationship with the divine, the summum bonum, right? Um, uh, we see the concrete, whereas that's the universal. So AI is by definition a product of human creation. It cannot partake in this transcendent quest, right? This unrestricted desire to know. It has no awareness of purpose beyond its functional design. So if we apply all that to AI, what does that mean? So if we ground it in this type of anthropology, what we tried to argue in the book, at least, and hopefully we make a convincing argument, is that AI can't replicate the moral and the existential dimensions that define human life. Humans not only act but also reflect on the moral implications of their actions. AI, on the other hand, can only follow the ethical guidelines that are programmed into it, or that the code permits it to acquire in an adaptation into it, without actually understanding or engaging with the moral content of those actions, right? And then, of course, there's the fundamental ideal of the soul, which is, of course, central to Catholic
Sure.
anthropology. It
Yeah.
introduces a metaphysical dimension to human consciousness, which is not reducible to the materialism that is often taken as the starting point, right? It's already assumed, it's already built into their
Yeah.
starting point. So AI may simulate cognitive processes, but it lacks that metaphysical depth of human consciousness, which is inextricably linked to the soul, because in Catholic anthropology, we're hylomorphic beings, in-soul body and embodied souls, the same thing, right?
Right.
So we try to bridge in our work, in the work that I'm trying to do, philosophy and theology. So by integrating Lonergan's philosophical insights with this kind of anthropology, what we try to offer is a more comprehensive critique of the optimistic claim that AI can never achieve human-like consciousness or personhood. And I think that this interdisciplinary kind of approach to the topic, which I think is unique, I think allows us to tackle both the technical, so on the actual technical side of what AI is,
Right.
and the philosophical misunderstandings that are so pervasive in society, right? So Lonergan's philosophy, I think, helps us to clarify the epistemological distinctions between human knowing and AI data processing, which are definitely not the same thing.
Yeah.
His notion of objectivity as rooted in self-transcendence. An authentic objectivity is the fruit of an authentic subjectivity. This intentionality that's fundamental to his understanding of consciousness shows why AI can never actually achieve genuine knowledge, right? So theologically, understanding humans as more than just biological machines, but as persons with that divine spark, I think emphasizes the incommensurability, that gap that can never be bridged between
Hmm.
humans and AI. And I think that this theological stance is crucial for what I consider to be a holistic apologetic, a holistic defense against the notion that AI can ever become human. This kind of like
Right.
evolution, because the word become involves that kind of evolution that makes that
Right.
jump. that gap, and I think that that gap is incommensurable.
Yeah, that's interesting. I thought of a couple things, a couple different things that I wanted to mention, but let me quickly hold on. So I actually just finished up a book, and it's when you were talking about the image of God. That's like largely what this is my book right here. It's coming out on October 1st, a couple of days,
Hmm.
and
Who's the author? Sorry.
me.
It's your that's the book that you sent me. Yes.
No, this that's a novel. This is a different book. This is like the nonfiction version of the
Very
fiction book that
cool.
I sent you.
Where can we get that? If you
It's
could
on
send me a
Amazon.
copy, I would definitely review it and publish a review.
Oh, sweet. Thank you. Yeah. And so it's basically looking at the anthropology of Genesis 1 through 3. It's sort of a popular take, so it's not,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not academic, but one of the things that studying those texts really helped me to understand is that the image of God, when we look at, biblical texts, we normally think of like what we should be doing in terms of moral things. And I think morality might be one of those things that that a machine can't really enter into. But but before that, there are sort of what I call like submoral things or pre-moral things that we're standards that we're held to. The image of God is taken in the context of the human image of God passages is the creation mandate. Sorry. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Those sorts of things that we're supposed to be doing that aren't particularly moral. I'm not being necessarily immoral by not being fruitful and not multiplying, but we have these I mean I boil it down to creativity, work, rest, and community. So those four ideas of what it means to be human before there's any sin, any need for moral
Hmm.
guidance, right? So if we look at any one of those things, machines can't do that. They can't. Um, there's no significance to the creative endeavor. There's no need for rest because there's no need for for work or toil, and this drive that we have inside of us to commune with one another and to commune with God, just can't exist. So I think that there are sort of there definitely could be analogs to those things in a digital world. I don't know, but it's definitely it has to be different because it's a different the stratum of where this thing even exists is completely different.
Sure, maybe
There's
there could be some sort of analog in terms of simulation, but take for example, I don't know, creativity, co-creation. You kind of mentioned them as being like humanity's pre-moral purpose, right, or ante moral purpose, so beforehand. So
yeah
humans are called to participate in God's creative work, cultivating, becoming the stewards, caring for the world. And this creativity, though, is not mere technical innovation, but involves the ability to perceive beauty, to engage in art, to shape culture.
yeah
And AI will able to assist, supplement, integrate into these kind of creative tasks. The systems lack that inherent purpose or understanding of that beauty, of meaning,
right
truth that characterizes human creativity, right? Humans live in a world mediated by meaning and motivated by value, things that AI simply aren't capable of integrating, but perhaps at minimum simulating, right? The
yeah
Imago Dei means that humans are designed for that deep, meaningful relationship with God, with each other, with creation itself. Whereas AI, by contrast, can simulate the interaction but can't
mhm,
engage in genuine relationships because it lacks the consciousness and the capacity for love, for empathy, for self giving. You mentioned the thing about the mandate, right? There's even the mandate to subdue, maybe to have dominion. Maybe we reflect on it as a stewardship role
yeah
that's inherently ethical. Maybe we can even define as being inherently ethical, even if it's a mandate pre-sin, right, before the fall, and it's oriented, however, towards the flourishing of all creation, right? It's not
hmm
only good in itself; it has an extrinsic purpose, right?
yeah
And this stewardship is not about the exploitation, but about the responsible governance that reflects God's goodness and order. And I think that AI can probably manage and process that kind of information, but it lacks that capacity for moral discernment and ethical responsibility that's integral for a human to be a steward, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I that kind of reminds me of like there's a certain, well, probably most people now believe that humanity is sort of a blight on the planet. You know, we're the fact that we're
It's that
here is mean
anti-natalist narrative, right?
right is like we're actually damaging the earth. We're causing I mean there's extents to which we are, but I think the reality is that there's at least like this symbiosis where the planet needs us and we need the planet. Like our work in subduing and ruling and ordering and making things beautiful, um, is part of what we're here for. And so if we were all dead and the planet just turned into one giant jungle, you know, that would be one form of beauty, but it would definitely not be the depth and the significance that the earth has supporting, you know, conscious human souls, if you want to use the word, I think. Um, so yeah, it's I think the anthropology of these of the early chapters of Genesis is really significant, and it helps definitely to reframe our understanding of what we should be, especially when you know modern anthropology is particularly in this you know oversaturated in technology and social media and these dehumanizing elements um, of our world. It's definitely a good way to kind of reframe.
Sure. Taking on the responsibility of being ethical stewards of the world tends to be a buttress against those kind of pessimistic narratives, things like antinatalism, right? The Mephistopheles type of narratives of it's kind of a Luciferian type of intellect to propagate that kind of narrative there, the antinatalist narrative. That's
Oh,
I
it's
think that
yeah, it's
that
terrible.
it's the underlying spirit that possesses that kind of the pushing of that kind of narrative. I think by definition is that kind of Luciferian narrative that I'd rather you know I'd rather reign in hell than serve in heaven type of thing, right? You know, you want to be the king of the you know in Game of Thrones the Daenerys says, "Do you want to be the queen of the ashes?" Right? And that kind of Luciferian intellect, yes, pushes you. Yeah, I'd rather be the queen of the ashes than bend the knee type of thing, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
I think there's also like an element.
Stewardship requires that carrying of the cross, right? It's not about the dominion of looking down, right? It's the Son of Man has not come to be served, but to serve, right?
Right.
That's the meaning of stewardship to serve.
Yeah, in my circles, I think another unfortunate factor is the certain eschatologies. Um, I think like the very popular around here is like this pre-trib, pre-mill um, eschatology, where basically, you know, one day a day is going to come and it's all gone and we're starting fresh. I think that is harmful to the idea of stewardship, just because people are like, well, who cares? You know, we'll pollute the earth and then
And
you know
just
it'll get fixed.
that's a good way to abdicate one's responsibility, wash one's hands, and commodify whatever's left. Right? It's kind of like the rich Optimates at the end of the Roman Empire saw that Rome was falling. Well, let's just loot the treasury essentially, right? With whatever's left, who cares?
Yeah,
It's all going to be burned down and rebuilt in the end anyway, right?
yeah, and that's tough, but I think you're definitely tapping into good resources, trying to you know apply theology and apply these like really traditional anthropological sources to these issues. So I think I'm excited, and you know when this next book comes out, you should reach out and I'll have you on again.
I appreciate that. Hey, it's quite a bit of work because it's trying to maybe we call it de-educate in the sense, or de-propagandize, to re-educate, to break down many of the implicit assumptions of the last 150 years, if not more, of Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thought, which resulted in the osmosis of accepting the postmodern narrative as de facto led to a complete relativization of everything that includes even into the things that were once thought unthinkable to relativize, like mathematics and the hard sciences. But we've gotten to that point where everything's essentially become relativized. There's no foundation, no center. And what I'm trying to do is trying to show people that whether or not you think that that's the case, everyone has that summum bonum, right? We are, by definition, there's no way around that, at least if you're not dead, motivated by value. And any instance of value betrays the fact that there's an ultimate value. And I'm trying to kickstart that again, a tradition that I did not start, that I'm not going to perfect, but that somehow seems to have been lost in the gutter within the last couple of centuries. And I'm trying to
Yeah,
bring back and show that there's not only value, but that beauty, truth, and goodness stems from this way of thinking.
absolutely. And I think it, it really, a lot of it boils down to what we think about ourselves. If we don't see, if we see ourselves as, possibly rational machines that have no free will and can't really
Well, it's a
affect.
good way to then, like I said, if you think about the world that way, you will therefore commodify and look at the world in a purely utilitarian way. If you look at yourself like that, you will project that onto others, right? And then you will equally use them in the same way. But we already see that. We already
Yeah,
see the commodification of life. It's it's the norm. It's not an exception. It's the norm now, especially in the
right.
West.
Yeah, I think that divide is actually really stark, and it's hard to really, for those of us who don't buy into those presuppositions, it's really hard to kind of pull yourself away from all of the implications. I think that if we did that more effectively, we'd probably be more aghast at at our lives and our world.
Mm. It's a difficulty, unfortunately, that I run into every day. It's because when you speak with people, and I've been guilty of this in the past, is many of these underlying narratives that I find to be incredibly destructive have become so normalized that, like I said, we've accepted as a consequence of a process of just historical osmosis. Just it's a slow metabolism that we've just come to accept it, that even in our everyday language, we tend to be automatic relativists, both cultural, social, and ethical relativists, right? And trying to inculcate, re-educate. I'm an educator. Trying to do that with students at the university level means undoing essentially their entire lifetime worth of
Yeah,
postmodern materialistic thought, which is incredibly difficult because you're introducing notions and presuppositions that are alien to them and ways of speaking that they've simply not heard or consider to be pure superstition. And as a Catholic, for example, I blame the lack of catechesis on that, right? I blame the leaders of Catholic institutions for not doing a good enough job of letting things just be swept under the rug or passing underneath the bridge, and essentially letting the enemy in the gates.
yeah, yeah. To that end, I think there's a certain amount of pessimism for the way the world is, but I think generations like our generation that kind of sees some of the problems, like my parents' generation, did not. Right? They set me loose on a computer at the age of 13, and all the troubles that came with it. But like I think as we start to reflect and have children, and that generation starts to interact with the world, and particularly the technological world, I think there's hope that even the church you mentioned,
Hope
the
is a
way that the
virtue,
church.
right? Whereas
Yeah,
it's a sin to feel despair, right?
yeah,
Have no
yeah.
fear.
And I think that like you're seeing people who are young now are being much more sincere with their faith, and hopefully more intentional with the the technologies and the stuff that we've got kind of, I don't know, tangled up in.
Well,
Who knows?
I appreciate you inviting me on. I look forward to having a copy of your book because it already seems super interesting. I love the topic, so I would love to give it a read and review it if you're okay with that.
That'd be great.
Um,
Yeah. So yeah, I really appreciate the time. Again, definitely let me know when the next one comes out. We'll do this again. And until then, we'll keep an eye out. I'll put all the links to your resources down at the bottom of this video, and we'll definitely keep in touch. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me.